Give me a thumbs up if you can see this.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. All right, give me a second, everyone. All right, well, welcome, and thank you so much for inviting me and having me here with you. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about why I chose this topic and thinking about the term for kiddos as a term of endearment, and definitely not undermining the greatness of children. My focus for our talk today is going to be on children between 3 and 8 years old. But I plan to lay a foundation for us today in terms of the development of the brain that further leads us to unique consideration and strategies we really need to employ when researching with and designing for children. So very briefly, I am a mom. I am an early childhood digital ethnographer. This is often the way I see my contribution to the lenses of observing how children are evolving around technology. And I have the distinct pleasure of working with our education and outreach team at code.org. So as we are thinking a little bit about designing for kiddos, I want to think a little bit more about changes that we have witnessed for the past decade, and certainly for the past 10 months. An exponential shift in the creation of software, hardware, online programs, digital tools, and experiences aim at supporting children's virtual learning from home. So what does that really mean? As this shift are taking place, we do need to take in consideration the vast differences in practicing user experience research and design for adults versus children. For instance, let's think a little bit about our color palette and the ability to capture users' attention. This is going to look quite different between children versus adults. More vivid with children, a little bit more tepid maybe and organized for adults. Let's think a little bit about gestures that move a target forward and or motor skills that are going to be required. They're very fine and minute for adults. Adults' finger size are much larger than children. Children are still developing their motor skills, which require a different approach to be able to get access to their targets. I also want to point out the difference in terms of expected interaction between our user, the product, and their environment. Is there an adult as kiddos are interacting with their product or their software or their hardware? And is the role of the adult that of a navigator, further desired to support the role of a driver, our kiddos? Let's talk about user behavior and some of the consideration to think about. Sometimes, depending again on the age range, children are going to require a little bit more time to process commands, but will be quicker at tapping the screen and or clicking on the mouse pad versus adults that are going to process the information a little faster, but are going to just need a little bit more time to be able to orient themselves as to what command needs to take place next. And certainly not the last in my conversation today and for the purpose of our presentation, but an additional consideration to keep in mind is thinking about the reading, speaking, and listening level and development. Products that have sound and visual effects tend to be certainly more enticing for our children, but maybe quite a bit of an overload for adults. I introduced myself as a mom, and so as I traverse and move through the world of online and virtual learning with my own budding kindergartner, I can vouch for the very last one particularly. There is always this desire to have the sound accompany the reading, whereas I just want to make sure that I move along and read. So there's always that very nice interaction, negotiation, as I like to call it, between my son and I, particularly when we navigate his learning experience. And so the next steps that I wanted to take you through really are reflection, as we're thinking a little bit about designing for our children, designing for kiddos. I would like to ask you to recall your first experience with a personal computer or a digital device. And I have chosen two pictures to really show the divide, at least as I experienced it years ago in college, utilizing a Macintosh PC, which has completely changed today, versus kiddos who often come out of the womb sometimes, as we like to say, exposed to the world of tapping and swiping. What I've also certainly have thought of is the excitement of interacting with a digital device, or sometimes the sheer frustration, the unboxing, the fear or the elation in cause. Our interaction with PCs and digital technology have changed today and are rapidly evolving. What may not be evolving as fast is as our development, certainly as a species. And what does this have to do with designing? Quite a bit, actually. We now know more than ever about kiddos' brain science and development. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about setting the foundation for us to think about birth to 3 years old. This leads to where we can then start laying the foundation for strategies to engage kiddos 3 to 8. As I like to say it, children are born geniuses, simply as that, geniuses. And this is the reason why. They are incredible neuronal synaptic clefts. The space between two neurons or nerve cells are sizzling, as I like to say it, between birth and 3. We will never have as many neurons and synaptic clefts as we have in our lifetime as we did between birth and 3. Our brain size by the age of 3 reaches 80% of the weight of an adult brain. So you can imagine the amount of, as I like to call it, magic that takes place between birth and 3 and the settling and the foundation of that brain development. These are also formative years that shape certainly information processing, motor, cognitive functions, secure relationship with a caregiver, learning to create that attunement between caregiver, our environment, and any other tools that shape our experience. And I wanted to highlight this really as a space for us to think empathetically as we are starting to lay the foundation for strategies to design for our kiddos. Of course, the next set of years, between 3 and 5 years, the synapses on fire settle down a little bit. And believe it or not, we call the term pruning or shedding. They're a little bit more settled. Motor skills, while not fully developed, are still experiential. The visual and the audio feedback becomes a little bit more instantaneous for children. Impatience can show up as a form of anger or frustration, and can also show up as an opportunity for kiddos to start understanding how to self-regulate. And of course, between 6 and 8, we go through this enormous expansion of their reading, vocabulary repertoire, fine motor skills that are being chiseled, and emotional regulation takes place. So this is the space between 3 and 8 when we're starting to think a little bit about 1, researching, and 2, designing, that we really need to take in consideration their capacity, certainly physical, mental, and emotional. This is also the time when there's an overall creation and acquisition of individual experiences that propel these users within this age range forward. These developments certainly impact our capacity to choose the best research methods and the tools to engage children in talking about products that we're designing and certainly using the products that we're designing. So now I want to dive in a little bit more into our strategies, now that we have a good basis for understanding brain development and the impact that the environment has on children. I want to dive into a few strategies that can really help us as researchers and designers. And the way I want to engage into these strategies is think about the user experience as that of mirroring the experience of kiddos on a playground playing. And so I wanted to think about these strategies as questions. The first one, does this user experience and interface promote large movements? Think about kiddos on the playground, large movement, big jumping. Well, while we may not necessarily have kiddos jump around using our products, we could. What I really am alluding here is very specifically to their motor function, gross versus fine. We need to ensure that kiddos can actually, or children users, can swipe or tap. We have found that dragging, dropping, zooming in and zooming out and rotate are so minute and fine that they're making it very difficult for children, particularly between 3 and 5, that may not have those skills fully developed, to actually move towards the engagement. And these can be quite overloading for children and full-on frustrating. Are signs that we're utilizing big and colorful and discernible? Just think again of a playground. Can child users actually able to point toward a sign and say, there it is, that's the chute I want to use, that's the slide. Likewise, does a user experience or the product look like a big playground? Our target design must be big, visible, colorful, so as not to create a challenge for these little fingers to hold the target, but at the same time being able to move it. Now, big and colorful also does not necessarily mean too busy. There's just that experience for the child to still experience colorfulness and simplicity. Does the design support exploration without getting answer right away? Is it exploration just for the sake of exploring? I have seen a couple of interfaces or games where there's a cave that leads to a trunk, and the trunk is it. This is the goal. Is the goal to get to the trunk with a bunch of gems? Well, can opening the trunk actually lead to observing, feeling, asking questions rather than the trunk as the reward? If there is a reward indeed, is it elegant? And when I think of elegant, is an end button or complete and confettis? Or does this reward move away from exploration a little bit more towards competition, which sometimes can lead to frustration if it's not very well guarded? We have noticed in my research that children are more likely to come back to an activity, a product, or an app if they simply enjoy the pleasure rather than having a goal tied to the activity. This is another way to really be able to assess their level of engagement. Does this play date on this playground conclude with a natural stopping point to support self-regulation? Is there a warning that lets kiddos understand that the activity is coming to an end? Or, as I've seen in multiple interfaces, does the game or the program move on autoplay in advance without stopping, which then creates a bit of frustration between certainly the caregiver or the parent and the child or the teacher in having to create a stopping point, because there's that continuous need to be able to move on to the next activity.
Sabine, sorry to interrupt you. You have a couple of more minutes left and then 5 minutes for Q&A, so just a heads up.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that, Vivian. All right. So I also, in terms of thinking about strategies, is thinking about the interaction with the caregiver to maintain the presence of the product, as I like to call it, as a holistic, collaborative experience rather than an individual experience. How are we encouraging for the user experience a kiddo to make sure that they have an adult in the room with them as they're utilizing this product? So interaction with the caregiver is important. Engagement with real life metaphors. Surprisingly, we're finding, or maybe not surprisingly, we're finding that there is a loss or sometimes warped sense of reality when children are utilizing symbolism or symbolism being utilized in the interface. For instance, kiddos thinking about a globe and may not necessarily continuously think about a globe as a 3D. So as we are creating our user interface, either think about that engagement and or add that engagement through words or visual inside the product, so that as children engage into real life items, they are also have that relationship with what it may look like in real life. So a prime example might be thinking about a picture album. We are now moving towards swiping from one photo to another. Whereas as I've experienced it, and maybe others on the call as well, and the webinar have experienced it, is actually that feel of turning the page, looking at a photo album where pages are being turned. So engaging in real life metaphor as the UX engagement is incredibly important. I added collaborative play and self-esteem because it needs to remain incredibly playful and supportive of that self-esteem and development. Lastly, I wanted to think a little bit more about what should we consider when we're creating, what should we consider when we're creating UX for kiddos design team. We should rely heavily on observation. Communication about the product design will be acted out. One of the best ways to be able to engage our children, particularly 3 to 8, is provide them with the product and just observe. Get your pen, get your paper, and just take it all in. And the way we're going to understand how they communicate is literally by watching them. Also engage children as your co-designers, arts, crafts, any tools that you may have that may give you any insight or inkling about what this may look like as a final product is going to be completely acted out with kiddos utilizing arts and crafts. And also engage and support what may be considered mistakes, and also observe how they're moving through these conflicts, so often, as we like to call them, micro conflicts. And in closing, I really would like for us to take in consideration the variety of roles, depending on who's watching our webinar today and what is the size of either the organization or the team, is to think about the role of the parent. I talked a little bit about the coder versus the navigator earlier, and thinking about where the parent or the caregiver plays that role. Possibly having an early childhood educator as part of that team to discuss and or to even try out your products. Where does the designer fit, the designer and the researcher fit into the process, and what is their own background and understanding of children development? Keep in mind that playground, that it should be like a playground, that user experience should emanate or should mimic a playground. Really think a little bit about the role of the product in keeping that child self-regulated. And lastly, the role of the product in maintaining an active learning environment. I thank you for your attention today. And I wanted to make sure that you have my contact information, Sabine at code.org. I'd like to encourage you to take a look and experience Hour of Code next week as we celebrate computer science education at code.org and throughout the world. And lastly, take an opportunity to experience our brand new experience, which is Code Bites. They're smaller and more age-appropriate opportunities to experience coding and computer science, launching next week as well. And this is what I wanted to share with you. And if there are any questions, I am happy to answer, and I will stop sharing here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sabine. Your presentation was amazing.